Unit 7, Period 7, Section 3. Today we're going to talk about the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president of the 20th century. Um, he had served as vice president to William McKinley at the end of the 19th century. McKinley had been reelected in 1900 and was in the second year of his second term when he was assassinated at the World's Fair in Chicago, and Teddy Roosevelt ascended to the presidency. Teddy Roosevelt was what many consider the first progressive president in American history. And what do I mean by that? Well, he brought about a lot of change as president of the United States. Now, he was a Republican, which tends to be conservative in their political philosophy, but Teddy Roosevelt wanted to realize that there were a lot of problems in our country that needed to be fixed, and the government was best able to fix those problems. The first one is a man named Upton Sinclair had written a book called The Jungle. And in this book about the meatpacking industry, he went into the meatpacking industry to expose how workers were being mistreated. But when he got in there, he saw how the meat was being processed and how nasty it was. And so he wrote a book called The Jungle, which he gave a copy to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt read his copy of The Jungle, and the result was Teddy Roosevelt pushing through Congress and something called the Meat Inspection Act, which called for federal inspectors to be placed in meatpacking plants to ensure the safety of the product that's being produced for the consumer. The result is a federal agency known as the United States Department of Agriculture, and their responsibility is to inspect agricultural products at near the point of consumption to ensure the safety for the public at large. And so a lot of times when you go in a meat department, you'll see a stamp like this on the meat. Another reform of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency was conservation. Teddy Roosevelt believed that the largest landowner in the United States, the federal government, had a responsibility to ensure that these lands were available to future generations. So while president, he was responsible for setting aside federal lands for the construction of at least 5 national parks while he was president. This is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt on top of a mountain and in a national park, and this man's name is Gifford Pinchot, who was head of the U.S. Forest Service and really believed in preserving the lands pristinely for future use. Eventually, today, you can see all the national parks, and Teddy Roosevelt was a major player in getting these parks built and set aside. Another reform of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency was the building and the construction of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was a waterway built connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Teddy Roosevelt, while serving during the Spanish-American War, realized that there needed to be a way to get goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific faster than going around the southern tip of South America, but also a better way to get warships, American warships, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So this led to the construction of the Panama Canal. It cost the United States $400 million. And when completed now, today, ships going from the Atlantic to the Pacific can travel through the canal and shorten the distance for trade purposes by many, many miles. This is the design of the Panama Canal. Most of the canal is a lake spanning across the country of Panama, but you need locks to be able to raise ships up to that lake in order for them to travel across the country. The Panama Canal was completed in 1914, but Teddy Roosevelt's really given credit for making sure that it was completed. The final aspect of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary is the idea that not only do we want Europeans, as seen as this political cartoon, to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but Teddy Roosevelt was willing to use military intervention. He called it the big stick, to keep the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere, specifically out of South America. So the definition of the Roosevelt Corollary is big stick, or the threat that the United States would use military might to keep European interference out of South America. We'd like to show just a short video of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policies.
Foreign policy at the turn of the century was characterized by three vastly different philosophies: Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, William Taft's dollar diplomacy, and Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt abided by the African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He applied this big stick theory to American foreign policy, believing the U.S. should take a strong role in Asia. In 1905, Roosevelt intervened to end the war between Russia and Japan over Korea and Manchuria. When Japan was angered by racist sentiment in the U.S., Roosevelt arranged a gentleman's agreement. He would see that Asian discrimination ended, but in turn, Japan would have to limit Japanese immigration to the U.S. In a show of growing U.S. naval might, Roosevelt launched 16 warships on a world tour. Painted brilliant white, the flotilla was known as the Great White Fleet. The tour was a triumph. The U.S. was regarded as the most potent naval power after the British. In the interest of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Roosevelt turned his attention to a narrow strip of land in Colombia, the Isthmus of Panama. In 1903, Roosevelt's Secretary of State John Hay failed in an attempt to negotiate a treaty with Colombia for the land. But U.S. interests were not to be denied. Roosevelt backed a Panamanian revolt and negotiated for the Panama Canal Zone. Work began. Massive locks were designed to raise ships through the mountains and then lower them on the other side. 1.53 million cubic meters of concrete were poured, 70,000 workers recruited, and $400 million was spent. A marvelous engineering achievement, the canal was finally completed in 1914, just in time for World War I. In 1904, Roosevelt wielded his big stick again, adding a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Initiated in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine established a policy to limit European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's corollary went further. It stated that the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary was exercised the very next year in 1905 in order to relieve the Dominican Republic's debt to threatening foreign creditors.